the end of another week for our Bible reading plan in Acts. And today I want to call you back to something that Alex talked about on the very first day of our reading plan. Do you remember how she clued us in to the way that Luke designed this book? To the fact that he designed it pretty masterfully to intricately connect back and parallel the Gospel of Luke. He's trying to draw a connection between the way Jesus lived, the different stages he went through in his ministry, and to show how that's reflected in his disciples now, after Jesus has ascended. Today, I think we see that illustrated for us really beautifully in this section through Peter. Did you notice that there were elements of today's reading that maybe felt a little bit familiar? I feel like we're almost supposed to get this sense of deja vu, because with the two healings that Peter does in this section, I think Luke is calling us back to miracles that Jesus performed in the Gospel of Luke. First, Peter heals Aeneas, the paralytic, and I think Luke is trying to echo Luke 5 when Jesus heals a paralytic man. Same with Dorcas. I think when Peter heals, when he raises her up, I think we're supposed to hear similar things to what we did when Jesus raised Jairus' daughter from the dead. He's creating some parallels, and after you watch this video, I actually really encourage you to go back to Luke 8 especially, and look at that story of Jesus raising Jairus' daughter, and just compare these two sections, see the way that Luke is connecting dots and weaving them together for us. It's really cool. Now, there's also a third thing I think that Peter does in this section. It's not as obvious, but it's really a great reflection of his rabbi. Did you notice at the end of the chapter here, 9 verse 43, it says that Peter stayed in Joppa for many days with one Simon, a tanner. I don't know if that struck you as odd or kind of like this weird afterthought at the end of the chapter. I think it's significant because tanners at this time were pretty much social outcasts. They would be working with dead animals all of the time, and so they would be, according to the Torah, consistently ritually unclean. And so people like the religious leaders, like the Pharisees and the Sadducees, would steer clear of people like Simon the tanner. Oftentimes, tanners were actually mandated to live a certain distance outside of their town. There's just this sense that people were not willing to rub up against people like Simon. They were not willing to keep company with people like Simon. But Peter does. Peter does. And who does that remind you of? I think it's supposed to remind us of Jesus. Jesus who ate with tax collectors and sinners, who sat down at a table with them, who welcomed them into his fold to follow him. Jesus who drew near to people who were on the fringes and who other people shunned. Peter is starting to look like his rabbi. It's this theme that Luke has been constructing throughout the book of showing us how, through the transformation of the Holy Spirit, these disciples start to say things that Jesus says. They start to have the qualities of Jesus. They start to do the things that Jesus did. They start to look like Jesus. Here's a second thing I'm noticing here, though. I think there are times throughout the book of Acts, which I think can kind of tend to feel like this really fast-paced kind of spiritual roller coaster for the apostles. We're reading about really high highs for them as they perform miracles and see mass conversions and baptize people, but also serious dangers and spiritual lows as they're put in jail, they're on trial, they're persecuted. And it seems like every once in a while Luke comes up for air and says, aside from what's happening to the apostles, here is the state of the church. I think he does that in verse 31. He says, so the church throughout all Judea and Galilee and Samaria had peace and was being built up. and walking in the fear of the Lord and in the comfort of the Holy Spirit, it multiplied. Those people, they are thousands of people that we have been reading about their conversions and their baptisms that have never been named personally. But they are no less a part of the church than Peter is, or James, or John, or Paul, or any of the apostles. They are building the church. They're being transformed. And one thing that really stands out to me from our reading today is I feel like Luke shows us a beautiful example of what these people looked like in Dorcas. Did you notice how much time he spends telling us about how sweet and wonderful she was? He takes the trouble to tell us how she served her community by making clothes. He tells us that there are all of these widows gathered by her bedside to mourn her death. And we learned last week that widows were people who were on the fringes themselves. And so I think it's really meaningful that Dorcas drew close to them, that she connected with people that end up feeling like society has given them the short end of the stick as far as life goes. N.T. Wright talks about this passage and says that Luke here celebrates the fact that what Peter does is important, and so is what Dorcas does. It's like Dorcas is smiling at us from the page, and N.T. Wright says that it's clear here that ordinary people are not ordinary to God. And so, as you think about what it means for you to look like Jesus, to walk like Jesus, and talk like Jesus, and do the things that your rabbi did, I hope you feel encouraged by the fact that if your life doesn't have such sweeping high highs and low lows like Peter's, if your life is more quiet, more quote unquote normal, like Dorcas, that you are the image of God too, that you are representing your rabbi too, that God is with you, just like he's with Peter. I mean, he's with Peter and Paul, but he's also with people like Aeneas and Dorcas and Simon. And so whatever it looks like for you in your specific context, in your everyday life, as you live your normal, you can be like your rabbi. Ordinary people are not ordinary to God. Take comfort and take care, friends.